There's a question I get asked a lot. I bet you do too. And that's, how do we reach across the political divide in our country? How do we communicate with our friends and our families who seem to live in a different world, who seem to have a different set of values, who use many of the same words, but they mean completely opposite things? So how do we communicate in this difficult, polarized political time? I think the first thing I would want to say, just as a kind of a footnote to this whole conversation, is that we're not talking about being conservative being good or bad. We're not talking about liberal being good or bad. Those are relative terms. And there are things always that we need to conserve, and there's things that we need to liberate. So there's a balance between being conservative and liberal. That's not what we're talking about today. What is happening in our country is not conservative. It's obviously not liberal. But the invention of a whole set of facts, when a president says fact checking, it has a liberal bias. When a president says that all journalists who criticize have a liberal bias. When people say scientists have a liberal bias because they disagree with the president. Just that whole concept where one person is at the center of the spectrum and everything is measured in terms of that one person. That's not conservative or liberal. That's what historically has been called fascism. It's an authoritarian figure who transcends things like facts. Studies have been done of Fox News where they discovered that it's so propagandistic that people who only watch Fox News do more poorly on fact tests than people who don't follow the news at all. In other words, propaganda is more debilitating than ignorance. So there is liberal bias, there's conservative bias. That's not what I'm talking about today. What we're talking about today is an approach that shuts everything down and makes a bridge impossible. If there's racism in the equation, if there's sexism in the equation, if there's anti-Islam, anti-Semitic, when there are victims involved, when there are people being oppressed, we're not talking about conservative or liberal. So the question we're going to ask is how can we communicate without compromising our obligation to work for social justice? How can we stand up for the people that are being oppressed without shutting down attempts to reach people who are different than we are? So we're going to be looking at a very strange passage today from the Sermon on the Mount. It's one that I probably would have skipped if it weren't in the series. We're just going almost verse by verse through the Sermon on the Mount. And this is one that's very troubling to me. See what you think. This is Matthew 7:6. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls before swine. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Now, at the surface of things, that looks really prejudiced, and it may be. It may be that Jesus was thinking of Gentiles as dogs, other people as swine. I don't think we can go back in time and figure out exactly what Jesus meant. And it's important to remember that Jesus did not speak or think in English. So in some ways, the more we study the English, the further we may be getting away from the insights that Jesus has in mind. I personally believe that Jesus was teaching love. It's a love that does justice. And I think that we have to put everything in that context. Clearly, that's what Paul said. Paul said, make love your aim. So for all the imperfections that Paul had, it's helpful to realize he was trying to aim towards love. And I think that Jesus is trying to aim us towards being a loving person. I don't think Jesus' focus is trying to make us good Christians. this is very important. I think what Jesus is trying to do is help us to be good human beings. To do that, we have to think organically, because if we get too literal, we can get mean, we can get cruel, because we lose touch with our empathy for other people. So to think organically, what Jesus may be saying, instead of saying, pearls are valuable, swine are not, he may be saying swine don't care about pearls. Dogs don't care about things that are holy. So one thing means don't speak in terms of values that people don't have. Don't speak in religious jargon that people don't ascribe to. It could mean wait for the teachable moment when people are open and available to things. And so we might reframe this saying, instead of pearls before swine, is don't plant your seeds on the sidewalk, as a way of saying, if there's resistance, if you can tell people are just trying to shut the conversation down by calling you names, by kind of a bullying techniques, state your truth and let it go. It's possible that Jesus is trying to say that. It's really important to remember always that the human brain did not evolve to understand truth. The human brain evolved to survive, which means it's very difficult unless we test ourselves, unless we hold ourselves to certain standards. It's very hard for human beings to seek truth. We love being right. We love, finding facts that prove that we were right. But the human brain resists ideas in the same way the body resists germs and viruses. Insights that would challenge our definition of who we are things that we fight, like King Kong on the Empire State Building swatting at the planes. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing in America today. Think of the changes that have taken place that challenge people's definitions of who they are. As a white male Christian, I was taught a view of history where white people discovered everything, invented everything. And I had to grieve my way out of that history. Clearly that's wrong. Clearly it's a large world, and there are lots of wonderful, wonderful cultures through history and presently today. We're not the only good people on the planet. And when we develop a vocabulary that says because we're American, because we're Christian, because we're male, because we're white, that somehow we're more central to the story, then we have to grieve our way out of that. Right? You can't just think your way out of this sense of identity, because it's tied to all of your emotions too. So a lot of what we're seeing is people who've lost their identity. And a part of our challenge is to help them find a new identity that gives them true value, and to realize they're better off when they don't have to try to hold somebody else down, that we are as a species. So Jesus came to teach, I think, a new vision of humankind, where there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, in terms of value, that every race is equally valuable, every gender is equally valuable, everywhere along that spectrum, that all adds to the human family. So I think Jesus may be trying to get us to stop fighting with human nature and plant our seed, speak our truth, and then let it go. Wait for the teachable moment. Wait for when people are ready to hear it. That doesn't mean you stop working for justice in the meantime. We have to stand up for the targets. But one of the things that occurs to me, and this may be relevant, it may not, is that the word dog that's used in this verse, it's true it was used of Gentiles, but there was also a group of philosophers called the dogs. The cynics is the way that's remembered. But they weren't, that wasn't a put down. What they were trying to do is get down to be as organic as possible. So they didn't want to pile up a lot of things, and they tried to live with as few needs as possible. So we could learn something from them. There's nothing wrong with a dog, but a dog doesn't relate to religion. A secular person may be more natural, more human than the religious person. And so speaking religiously to the non-religious, speaking in the jargon of Christianity, may be, that may be part of what is being spoken here. It may be a put down, but it may be that the dogs are closer to the humanity that we're trying to strive to than the people who are lost in religion. I mean, if you look at the whole of the teachings of Jesus, he's going to criticize the religious a whole lot more than the non-religious. So this may not be so much a put down of other people as it is an awakening for us. And pigs, pearls mean nothing, I would imagine, to a pig. They'd much prefer to have acorns. And I think they're probably wiser than we are, because when you have an artificial economic system, an artificial system of values, it doesn't feed you. And another primary teaching of Jesus is don't strive for bread that doesn't feed you. So it may be a put down of swine to say, don't waste your pearls on swine, but it may also be as basic and loving as saying don't speak to other people using value systems that are not theirs. When we don't appeal to the universal human condition, when we have an artificial system of value, an artificial system of importance, we're not feeding others. So it's possible that the dogs are again, like, for example, secular people, just as good as we are, but they need us to speak in a common language. And pigs are just as invaluable as any other species, but pearls don't feed them. So to speak to others in terms of what has value to them. Who knows? We can't go back in time. And again, Jesus didn't speak English. So the more we kind of try to define and parse things out, the further we may be getting from his purpose. But if we lift up this verse to say, how does it illumine my life? How does this make me more loving? Then I think what it may be saying is speak your truth and then let it go. In these times of incredible danger and fear and grief, people will sometimes need to defend themselves from truth. That doesn't mean that they're not going to learn it later. It just means this isn't the teachable moment. So Jesus may be saying, plant your seed, but not on the sidewalk. If a person is resisting, if they don't want to hear what you have to say, then after you've spoken your truth, let it go. Because there are other people that are going to come along. And wisdom has to unfold over time. We have to grow into it. And in many ways, we have to grieve into it. So what I would suggest in thinking of this verse and how it may affect your life. Let me read it again. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under feet and turn and tear you to pieces. When we corner people, when we push them beyond what they can absorb, they lash out in fear. We lash out in fear. Again, that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation. We have an obligation to stand up for people being oppressed. That's job number one. But job number two is changing hearts, changing minds, teaching. And that has to be done in a humane, compassionate way. So on the one hand, we're standing up for the people being oppressed. At the same time, we're not just trying to win arguments, we're trying to win hearts. And to do that, we wait for the teachable moment. If somebody doesn't want to hear what we have to say, we plant the seed and move on. We don't speak religion to people who are not religious because that's not a value system for them. We don't speak we don't speak of like economic success to somebody who's poor, who's trying to survive, because that doesn't feed their life. Communication is a two-way street. So I think what Jesus is saying, if I understand it, and you certainly are welcome to your own guesses as well. But we're on the cusp of a new world, just as Jesus was, trying to free enslaved people, help women realize that they are equal to men, and all of this. We're returning to that vision where there's room for male, female, Jew, Greek, slave free, and human beings aren't put in categories like that. We go beyond the categories, and that we teach with compassion and love. And I think the key that Jesus is giving us is we have an obligation to speak our truth, but then we need to speak it in love and let go and let people learn at their own pace. Well, I invite you now to your own reflection on these words, and there'll be a moment of meditation, and hopefully it'll be a time of centering, and you can restore yourself for the coming week. Go in peace.